Welcome again, Dr. Richard Gist, Deputy Director at Kansas City Fire Department, welcoming you to the second day of FRCE's virtual symposium. Today we're going to be focusing on stress first aid, the model of embedded peer support developed as part of the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation's Life Safety Initiative 13, a part of the Everyone Goes Home project. When we built that program, we were looking at a way of dealing with events that would integrate into the way a department ordinarily ran and be able to support providers at any level of situation and through any kind of circumstance. We came up with a logic model for that, which has driven much of the way that we operate since. That particular logic model is shown in the screen that we're sharing right now. You'll notice it begins with peer support, which encompasses everything that we do at all times and gives us ways to not just support one another in our daily lives, but in those things that become difficult, to be more mindful of one another and aware of our circumstances, and to help facilitate the flow into more focused kinds of care as the need would develop. In moving along this way, we've looked first to find a model of peer support that would be useful to any department, large or small, and in any circumstance, and most importantly, something that would help sustain us on a daily basis. What we came on as a model was the Navy and Marine Corps version of what they call Combat Operations Stress First Aid. It was built on some essential principles, 5 essential principles that have been known to help people dealing with traumatic and disaster events, and to bring those into focus in a way that allow us to deal easily with one another. And to help us make that transition, we relied upon Patricia Watson, then Senior Education Specialist for the National Center of PTSD of the Veterans Administration, and still a member of the Veterans Administration cadre of people who do this kind of work. Patricia is internationally known as one of the best translators of evidence-based practice into simple, usable procedures that all of us can understand and put to work. She's been an essential part of all the things that we've done at NFFF and FRCE in behavioral health, and very critical to the evolution of stress first aid. Stress first aid, by the way, is now the most investigated and examined method of peer support, not just in the fire service and EMS, but in a variety of other settings, ranging from healthcare settings to railroading. And Patricia has had her fingers in all of those translations. It's my real pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Patricia Watson of NCPTSD to explain where we are with this concept and how it fits into the work we try to do in first response agencies.
Hi everybody, this is Patricia Watson, and I'm here to talk about helping first responders help each other, the bigger picture. I'm very happy to be here with the FRCE and wish that we could all be in person, but I'm glad that we can all meet virtually and happy to be a part of this team. I know you've all seen a really nice presentation about resilience and the positive impact of social support. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about how we've tried to build in some of the research about social support into a logic model that we developed for behavioral health with first responders, and how we've tried to help facilitate social support with the stress first aid model. So to start with, there is a lot of research about the positive impact of social support on mental health. And what we have found is that on the one hand, social isolation and loneliness creates a greater risk for PTSD, suicide, and mortality. And on the other hand, social support can promote resilience across many different populations. The research has also shown that it buffers adverse impact of trauma, and it reduces the risk for common mental health disorders, including PTSD. We also know that our social support network has a big effect on our mental health attitudes and behaviors. So we know that the attitudes of our social support network about mental health issues can influence both treatment initiation as well as persistence in treatment and trust in providers. And we also know that stigmatizing attitudes about mental health issues in our social support network can result in non-disclosure of problems and less social support overall. So what's important for social support networks? We found in recent years that the overall quality and configuration of a support network is actually more important than the number of confidants. And I've mentioned this in many trainings that I've given, that when we talk to groups of people in a large room, at least half of them are going to be introverts. So when we talk about the importance of the protective aspects of social support, we're not recommending that people have a million friends. We're recommending that they are aware of the importance of social support and look to cultivate the connections that they have, whether that be one connection or a larger network of people. We also know that high quality social networks can buffer against perceived social isolation, even in those with PTSD and other mental health concerns. And that social efforts regarding mental health concerns can serve many different functions. But the most valued social support appears to foster resilience, either directly or indirectly. And let me speak about what's most valued. So in some recent research about mapping different types of social functions, we found that there are a number of different social functions. One is just to provide skills or knowledge that the person needs to improve different types of aspects of what they're grappling with. So this comes in the form of giving guidance or wisdom or expertise. It also comes indirectly through facilitating access to treatment and the willingness to engage in treatment. Next, we also know that social support can reduce isolation and increase social connectedness. So this could come in the form of a feeling that those who you work with have a shared experience with you, and you get each other and you understand what each other has been through. It can also come in the form of maintaining a relationship even when a person is going through difficult times. And it can also come in the form of accepting what the person is experiencing without any kind of sense of stigma or judgment. We know that social connections have a very important mechanism in terms of helping a person make meaning of what they've experienced when they've had difficult times, and also helping them to integrate that experience. And this comes in the form of validating, understanding what the person's been through and expressing that understanding, helping to uplift them or give them a different way of viewing things. And lastly, we know that social support can take the form of fostering emotional regulation. And the research suggests that social emotional regulation is much more effective than a person trying to individually regulate their emotions by themselves. And this can come in the form of facilitating coping, talking with the person about what worked for you, and indirectly through cueing that they might need further support in the form of mental health treatment. Couple of examples of emotional regulation. A direct example would be this quote. If she said, "I think you need to go relax or do something," then she probably knows what she's talking about. So I usually listen to her. She will know better than anyone else that I'm not 100% where I should be. So if she says, "Go sit in the studio and go play guitar or go to a comedy club" as a form of relief, she will not be shy in telling me. And then I just go do it. Another form of social cueing is this quote. He not only listens intently, he's honest with his feedback. He knows me so well that he will just intuitively ask me, "How are you doing? You don't sound good. What's going on?" And I would do the same to him. But I talk a lot, and if I get very quiet, then he knows something's weird and asks, "What's going on?" And he encourages, "I think it's time for another checkup." So you see, these are a few different examples of how the social network can change the course or the trajectory of a person's actions when they're struggling, when they're under stress, or they're trying to deal with something that's difficult for them. If you've got a friend who helps you think through what you might do next, it can really make a difference as to how your next steps emerge in the course of dealing with difficult life events. I want to play this clip from Brene Brown, who's done a lot of research on vulnerability, leadership, shame, social support. And in this clip, she's talking about social growth and development and why it's so important across the course of a lifetime.
95% of what I see that people call pathology is it's armor.
Yeah.
It's not, it's armor. It's behaviors and ways of thinking that I've developed to protect myself from being hurt. So this is what you see happen to people in midlife. And it's not a crisis. It's a slow, brutal unraveling. And this is where everything that we thought protected us keeps us from being the partners, the parents, the professionals, the people that we want to be. I think you can't replace the armor with something. I think it's curiosity is what you replace it. You just become very curious about yourself, about the world. Why did I react that way? When Tim asked me that question, I wanted to hit him over the head with a Topo Chico bottle. What was going on there? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. What is my obsession about this? You just become very curious. Curiosity is really the superpower for the second half of our lives. Because it keeps us learning, it keeps us asking questions, and it increases our self-awareness.
So one of the things I like about this clip is that it maps onto some of the work out of Harvard and Robert Kegan's shop, where they've developed what they call a developmental organization approach to human development. So within the context of a work relationship, we can acknowledge that people are growing and developing across the course of their lives. And if we're aware of that, we can set up the circumstances by which they grow and develop. And Kegan and his shop have found that people grow from being team players to being leaders to being inspirational leaders who take in feedback and set up circumstances by which people can grow and develop. So I think both individually and from a coworker support standpoint and from a leadership standpoint, if people are aware of these things, they can create circumstances by which not only are they doing their job well and becoming more proficient in their job, they're also supporting each other to grow and develop their identity, to grow and develop different ways to manage emotions, to manage conflict, to become the person they want to be. And I'll continue to play a few more clips to help illustrate this. So another thing that we found with social support research is that it kind of scales across a wide dimension of people trying to understand what social support does. So you've got the biological perspective all the way up to the kind of philosophical, existential perspective. So I want to play a clip from each in terms of what we found with the research. The first is a clip by Kelly McGonigal, who's a health psychologist, talking about the impact of social interactions on oxytocin, which is a very interesting and helpful hormone in the body.
Oxytocin doesn't only act on your brain, it also acts on your body. And one of its main roles in your body is to protect your cardiovascular system from the effects of stress. It's a natural anti-inflammatory. It also helps your blood vessels stay relaxed during stress. But my favorite effect on the body is actually on the heart. Your heart has receptors for this hormone. And oxytocin helps heart cells regenerate and heal from any stress-induced damage. This stress hormone strengthens your heart. And the cool thing is that all of these physical benefits of oxytocin are enhanced by social contact and social support. So when you reach out to others under stress, either to seek support or to help someone else, you release more of this hormone, your stress response becomes healthier, and you actually recover faster from stress. I find this amazing that your stress response has a built-in mechanism for stress resilience. And that mechanism is human connection. When you choose to view your stress response as helpful, you create the biology of courage. And when you choose to connect with others under stress, you can create resilience.
So that is very interesting research that's being conducted right now about the impact of social support on these hormonal aspects in our body. And oxytocin is one that's of great interest to researchers right now. And there are many others. Also, on the other end of the spectrum is neurobiological research looking at, the different parts of the brain that are activated when people engage in altruism, compassion. And so I want to play this clip from Matthew Ricard. I can't pronounce his first name very well. He's French, and he's a very interesting fellow who was raised by a physicist and an artist. And so all through his growing up, he was around very interesting people, and he actually had engaged in and received a degree in physics himself. But he, at some point in his life, realized that what he was looking for was a quality of well-being. So, and he hadn't seen that in any of the people he had grown up around, all these interesting researchers and artists who had come to his house. So he decided he was going to pursue that through being a Zen monk. And so as part of his travels, he collided with neurobiological researchers who asked him to sit and have imaging studies done of his brain while he meditated. And his form of meditation is a kind of kindness, compassion meditation. So I'm going to play this clip to show you what they found with that research.
With Richard Davidson, who is a well-known neuroscientist who is studying the effect of meditation on the brain. And at that time, we were studying the effect of compassion and loving kindness. What does it do to your brain when you engage in powerful loving kindness for all sentient beings? And it turns out that this is, among all meditative states, the one that triggers the strongest activation in certain areas of the brain connected with positive affect, with a sense of affiliation, of belonging. So in a way, different areas of the brain connected with well-being. So, okay, that was one guy. And then we got 20 more long-term meditators with similar results.
So as you can see, there's a lot going on with the social connectedness research and what's happening inside of our bodies when we're connecting with others. So from perspective of developing oxytocin, which is better for physical resilience, all the way up to areas of the brain being lit up or showing up that are connected to well-being and happiness, that are activated by compassion and this kind of altruism. It gives us a lot to think about in terms of what do we do when we think about
Oxytocin doesn't only act
when we think about first responders. So in the context of first responder work, what we tried to do was to develop a logic model that included peer support. And peer support is part of this logic model that recognizes that behavioral health involves a complex network of relationships. So behavioral health is not just about a one-off intervention or sending a person to mental health, because we know that many first responders will not end up going to mental health providers for stigma, because they're too busy, because they don't know what it is, because they don't have access to it. And so we wanted to create a model that recognizes this complex network of relationships that could serve to build a person's capacity for behavioral well-being and mental health. And we also wanted the model to build a workplace climate that supports openness, empathy, and access to care. So reducing stigma, having people feel like they could talk about the things that were stressful for them because everyone had empathy for each other. And also creating a bridge to care rather than an obstacle to care for more intensive mental health treatment. We also wanted this logic model to establish a mechanism for recognizing how stress might impact on both yourself and on the people around you, a mechanism for confronting stigma, and a mechanism for actively promoting access to needed levels of care. So this logic model looks complicated when it's shown like this. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this entire model. What I want to highlight is the fact that A third of this model involves peer support. And it involves the fact that if you can have effective peer support, and it seems to be enough, then the protocol terminates there. And we think that a large portion of what happens in first responder work environments is encapsulated in this box and doesn't necessarily need to move to the next box, which is behavioral health assistance program, specialized peer support teams, critical incident stress management teams, employee behavioral health programs, that type of thing, where you have more of a screening and maybe even an assessment to try to understand whether a person needs further assistance. And if they do, then they would go on to even further specialist assistance by a mental health professional. So as you can see, our logic model tries to incorporate different levels of care, depending on the need, as well as depending on the capacity of the organization to meet the needs. And as part of the work that I've done over the last few years with working with this logic model, I've also started studying different models of organizational support as well as organizational dynamics. And there's one called the Cynefin model that I've particularly appreciated because it talks about implementing different types of actions, different types of programs within complex systems. And this model would posit that it's very important when you're in complex times, and I would consider any first responder environment to be complex because you never know what's going to be happening from one day to the next. You're going to be responding to different types of things from day to day. What works one day might not work another day. The needs of the individuals in the system from one day to the next will change depending on what they're responding to. So it can be a chaotic and complex system because of that. Within those types of systems, the developer of this Cynefin model would suggest that it's important to build informal networks of people who have ways of communicating with each other and talking with each other outside of the more formal networks within that job. It's also important from the Cynefin model's perspective to create any program that you create in a system like this works better when it's an endoskeleton or a framework of core principles that will allow for emergence of new and different situations that are occurring, growth within the organization and use of this model, and adaptation of the model. And what I've seen happen in all the systems that I've worked within is that there's an appreciation for a core framework because people's capacity for engaging and using that framework is variable from day to day, week to week, month to month. So one day they might have a lot of time and energy to support their coworkers. Another day, they're just flat out full. They have no capacity to do that. So, but they can always go back to that framework and decide how much of it to use depending on what their capacity is. So this Cynefin model would suggest that the more uncertain you are about day-to-day actions and activities, the more you want to build in latitude and flexibility with any model that you introduce into a system like this. And you also want to start to identify naturally occurring narratives and naturally occurring stories that emphasize people going in the right direction, okay? And then you also want to think about scaling up or down by coming back down to the basic framework. If you have more time and energy, building up again, combining different aspects of that framework. It's very similar to how DNA works. And you work out the optimal instructional units. You decide how much people can absorb of that model and take in. And you give them the minimum so that novel forms can emerge, because novel forms of combining different aspects of a model are more resilient in nature. So how does that relate to what we've been doing? Well, what I like about the Cynefin model is it actually maps onto what we've been trying to do with a model that we introduced into the FRCE logic model. And that model is called Stress First Aid. I know a lot of you know about this model and you might be very familiar with it, but for those who don't know about the model, I want to give a bit of an overview of what we've tried to do with this model. So what we did was we took essential elements that we had identified with an expert panel of people from around the world who came together to talk about what do you do in situations where there is ongoing adversity? Because what had happened up to that point was that we were trying to extrapolate from post-event, post-trauma situations and research. And we put our heads together and said, you know, it's not always post-event. It often is that people are in the middle of ongoing adversity, ongoing stress. So what do we recommend for those people? And after looking at the research and putting our heads together, we came up with these 5 essential elements that we found were consistently related to people doing better in situations of ongoing adversity. And those elements are moving a person or a group towards a greater psychological sense of safety. It doesn't have to be absolute safety. It's just moving in that direction. Calming, moving them to a place of greater calm, however that might look for them. Helping them to be connected with social support, which is what we're talking about today. Helping them have a greater sense of self-efficacy, which is a fancy term for people feeling like they have either the skills or the resources to tackle or get through the situation. And the last element is hope, which is a broad term. It can mean a sense of faith. It can mean a sense of optimism. It can mean a person has a kind of value-based or philosophical base of meaning, ascribing meaning to situations that gives them strength and helps them to want to be the best person they can be through this situation. So what we found was that people don't have to have all 5 of these elements. They can have one very strongly or a combination of a few of these elements, but they tend to do better when they have at least one, and preferably more. And one of our top authors on this paper was Stephen Hoppel. He was the first author. And he has later gone on to talk about people having caravans of resources that they carry with them through life's trials and tribulations. And they call upon these caravans of resources when they need them. So we took this 5 essential element framework and we built a model called Stress First Aid, which is a long-term ongoing coworker support, leadership, and self-care model. And how it's different is that rather than prescriptively telling people how they should support each other, it just highlights the importance of coworker support and social support. And it acknowledges that that particular support that occurs amongst coworkers often only arises because of this unspoken understanding that occurs when people work together. They get each other, they know what each other has been through. And it's frequently only in these moment-to-moment encounters that people have in the work context that the right support can happen. Because I've heard over and over again that people have said, look, my coworkers are the only ones that understand what I'm going through. I mean, I love my family and they're really helpful in their way, but my coworkers are the ones I go to because I know that they understand what I'm going through. And we have this shorthand way of talking about things. So if people are aware of this, the importance of this type of social support, we hope that they're going to be more creative and disciplined about accessing it, both accessing it and giving it, and that they know that they are not to take for granted those moments. They're not to take for granted the ways in which people reach out to each other in the work context, because they are very important. And so I want to show a few different videos that I've gathered from an interview that Simon Sinek had with combat medics this past year. He was trying to interview them to ask them, what's helpful for you? What has been helpful for you in the context of the work that you've done as a combat medic? And he did this to try to get some assistance for healthcare workers who are working in the context of the pandemic. But as I was watching this video, I realized that these combat medics could very well be stress first aid spokespeople, because the way they speak about social support is very much exactly what we're trying to accomplish with stress first aid. Because stress first aid is meant to be a model that is rolled out across all the coworkers in an organization, ideally. It doesn't always happen that way, but that would be the ideal. What we're trying to do is create a culture shift that teaches people about the importance of social support and gives them some ways to support each other. So the first video I want to play for you illustrates one of the goals that we had with stress first aid, which was to reduce stigma. And this combat medic is talking about, just in a matter-of-fact way, why it's important to reach out and talk with people. So let me play this for you.
We just need to get the message out that, talking about what happened is not a sign of weakness, and asking for help is, like you said, shows more strength than weakness.
So as you can see, if you're surrounded by people that have that kind of attitude, it's going to be more likely that you reach out for support than if you're surrounded by people who just tell you to suck it up and keep it to yourself. And we started with the idea of reducing stigma by creating a stress continuum model. This model was already created when we developed stress first aid. The Navy and Marine Corps had developed it as a way to have a shorthand way of talking about stress, and to acknowledge that people aren't just either good to go or injured or ill. They go through a cycle of different zones of stress regularly, in and out of different zones. The green zone is what we call the ready zone, where a person is well trained and supported, they're functioning at their best, they're motivated, and they feel in control. When they go into the yellow zone, which is the reacting zone, usually it's because they're responding to multiple stressors, both at work and at home. And we talk about these double-edged sword vulnerabilities, which are that people who are drawn to jobs like this usually have strong values and ideals, which allow them to be strong in these jobs, but can also create vulnerabilities like not attending to yourself because you're so focused on others. And in this zone, you see mild or transient distress or impairment, changes in mood, motivation, focus, or physical changes. When you go into the orange zone, or the injured zone, it's usually because you're responding to either multiple long-term stressors, or you have introduced into your situation trauma, traumatic stress, loss, moral injury, and moral distress is where you're feeling like you wanted to do something differently than the way you did it, or the people around you didn't live up to your ideals and values, or the organization didn't live up to your ideals and values. And it can create a lot of inner conflict and suffering. So we wanted to acknowledge that people in jobs like this are exposed to all of these different types of stress: the long-term wear and tear, the moral injury, the loss, and the trauma. And usually when they have one or more of these, they're more likely to enter into this orange zone of stress. And what characterizes this zone is more severe or persistent distress or impairment, a loss of control of emotions or activities, the way that you behave, and a sense of no longer feeling like your normal self. And the last zone is the ill zone, the red zone. And this is just a continued, variation on the orange zone, where it's unhealed orange zone stress, or maybe additional stress that piles on, or maybe risk factors that can contribute to a person entering the zone of having a clinical mental disorder. And this is where symptoms are, more persistent, they worsen, more severe distress, more severe impairment in your functioning. So the stress continuum model endeavors to give people a shorthand way to say, look, I'm in the orange zone or I'm in the red zone. They don't have to talk about all their individual symptoms. They don't have to necessarily talk about what caused it, but they can have a conversation about it in a shorthand way in order to do something about it. And also, again, to reduce the stigma by saying, look, we all go in and out of these zones all the time. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about ourselves and our stress in the same way that we would talk about the stress on our equipment, the stress on our vehicles. And in that situation, we endeavor to tune up the vehicles. We endeavor to mitigate the stress that's caused on our equipment. And we pay attention to it so we can intervene early. We want people to be doing the same thing with their physical and mental selves that they would do with their equipment and their vehicles. So the stress continuum model's in place. Then there was a request to develop a model that could help people move from red and orange to yellow and green. We want to move them back towards the green zone. So the stress first aid model took these 5 essential elements, and we added 2 elements. The model is meant to be used when there's a stressor and an indication that a person has been affected by that stressor. So it's a little different than other models in that you would look for signs of distress or loss of functioning related to things that might be happening at home. It's not just about work stress. And it's also a little different because if a critical incident or a big stressor occurs on the job, you don't not just assume that everybody needs to talk about it. You are looking for signs of distress or loss of functioning before you might think about applying stress first aid. So we included check, which is observing, listening, paying attention to people. We also included coordinate, which is getting them help, getting them to the next level of care if needed. And then safety became cover. I want to show you an example of what that might look like.
Well, you have to be the rock for the people underneath you and really be there for them. But if you're a supervisor to other people, you need to make it your due diligence to go to that higher supervisor and be like, hey, we are struggling, and including myself, and we need your help, or we need you to do something and act for us. Because it's going to be tough for them, but you got to remember why you're in that supervisor position, and that's because you have the skills to represent other people to higher leadership. So passing that up is something that can be scary, but it's something that needs to be done. And remembering why you're in that position may help you to that.
So one of the reasons why I'm playing these little video clips for each of the core actions of stress first aid is that one of our commitments to this model is that we're always looking for practical examples from people within the culture. So I know I'm playing clips from people in the military culture, but what we've done is when we brought this model to fire and EMS, we have had focus groups, we've had interviews with people who are cherry-picked to be good leaders and good peer supporters. And we've asked them, what does this look like for you? What does cover look like for you? What does calm look like for you? And then we incorporated that into the manual, the workbook, the slides. When I give a longer training, I show video clips of fire and EMS professionals. When we go and talk with law enforcement, we show video clips of law enforcement professionals. So I'm showing you military clips just as an example because they're quick and easy to show right now. But typically what we'll do is we'll make each version map onto that culture. And I actually think that these military clips are universal. It's what we want to see in any first responder culture. So our goal is to try to make this model be very natural for people, that it fits with what they would typically do, that it validates what they typically do, and they can nod their head and say, oh, that's great. Now I know that what I do is supported by research and I should keep doing it and I should never take it for granted. So moving on to calm. Here's an example of a military professional talking about what it means to him to think about calm.
When you have time to relax, you better take advantage of it. Like, find out how to relax. So I know people that just don't know how to relax, and I wish I could teach them, but it's just the thing you got to figure out on your own. You know, like some people like to have tea before they go to bed, do the whole ritual. If that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do. You know, finding what is able to actually let your body relax, not just sit there and ruminate or sit there and just like waiting to relax, because it's something it's truly something you got to work on. It's similar to meditation, just mind.
Okay,
have
now
time-
moving on to connect. So calm and connect stayed the same, whereas safety became cover. Connect stayed the same, and here's that same service member talking about the importance of social support.
When you have like a team that you really trust, that you're meshed with real tight, it's easy to go talk to anyone. It doesn't have to be the whole team. It can be someone that you trust in the team, someone you get along with. And I think that we always, on our team, have a very good understanding that it's okay to show weakness and say, hey man, I'm having a really difficult time right now. Even if it's like a family matter, like in what their divorce, or if it's in combat, like, hey man, like I need to call you, like a little frazzled after this last event. Can we talk about it? And like, it's okay, because everyone, I think they want to be invincible, but that's not possible. Everyone has fear. Everyone feels things. You're human after all. And so once you acknowledge that, being able to let down your wall a little bit to somebody and talk about it in a realistic manner is more helpful than just kind of stowing away.
Okay, now moving on to competence, which is mapping onto self-efficacy. This is where we're trying to help people learn the skills, both work skills and well-being skills that can help them get through stressful circumstances. Here's another example.
One step at a time. So like whatever your target is, just bring it back a little bit. So if you're thinking about 8 things, of course you're gonna get overwhelmed and you can't do all at once. You can't multitask. Your mind's just not capable of it. So what we do is we just, hey, if you have to bring it back, what 2 things can you do? Or what 1 thing can you accomplish? And you do that and move to the next. And that's the best way to deal with it, because if you start trying to just think about everything that's coming down on you, yeah, you're gonna fry yourself quickly. For us, it's like we call it the 1-year target, or just go 1 foot at a time, 1 foot forward. Just that's what it takes to get through it. Then you can like look forward further after that if you kind of figure it out.
All right, and the last is confidence or hope. And this has a lot to do with what's going on inside a person, guilt, making meaning of situations, holding things inside. And it also has a lot to do with people around you who might inspire you to think differently and not feel ashamed of having stress reactions.
In the military, you can talk to people who have a little more years in the career field, and talking to them and seeing how they coped with it and how they learned and how they attacked that problem. I definitely took a lot out of that with talking to people who have dealt with it and how they cope with it, and using those techniques and skills and applying it to myself.
So what we know from the social support research is that in terms of burnout in jobs, that getting input from a mentor, somebody you feel has gone through a similar thing and has gone through it successfully, is one of the strongest protective factors against burnout. So I like that example. And lastly, another example from confidence is, as I said, reaching out and normalizing, reducing people's sense of shame, helping them to feel like they can have confidence and regain a sense of trust in themselves and others. Here's an example of that.
It's okay to feel the way you do. You're not weird or abnormal for feeling sad, feeling like almost lost or broken. That everyone goes through it, and that's okay. Like, you're allowed to have that feeling. That's human. And just be glad you can feel that feeling instead of just not feeling anything, which is much worse, I think. So go and embrace those feelings and talk about them, because that's healthy. It's part of being human.
So as you can see from these examples, if these gentlemen were trained in stress first aid, I feel like stress first aid did its job, which was to help people understand how to better support each other and also normalize the stress reactions that people can have when they're in very stressful jobs like this, and to help them be able to feel open about talking about these things and move them back to a sense of wellness and well-being. So I want to give one other practical example from Brene Brown about which I like because it quantifies social support in the same way that we quantify the awareness of stress reactions with the stress continuum model. Here's another example of quantifying checking in with each other using that type of scale to find out where the other person is, so that you can then mitigate the stress that you might be under. Now, she's talking about it in the context of a marriage relationship, but it could just as easily be applied to any work relationship.
And so what we do is we quantify where we are. So if Steve comes home and he'll be like, I got 20.
Just in terms of energy.
Just energy, investment, kindness, patience. I had 20. And I'll be like, I'll cover you. I got you, brother. I'll pull the 80. Sometimes we come home, which we have done a lot. My mom has been sick, and I'll say, I've got 10. And Steve, Steve, like 2 days ago said, I'm riding a solid 25. So we know that we have to sit down at the table anytime we have less than 100 combined and figure out a plan of kindness toward each other.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, because the thing is, marriage is not something that's 50-50. A partnership works when you can carry their 20 or they can carry your 20. And that when you both just have 20, you have a plan where you don't hurt each other.
Yeah, because you're threadbare, right?
Yeah, and so what we'll say is, I'm like, I've got 10, and he'll be like, I got maybe 25. We're like, put all the groceries that are supposed to be great and healthy in the freezer. We're ordering out. Get the housekeeper here an extra day, and we're canceling anything with people that we really actually don't like.
So how can we create some buffer in the system?
No, we do that.
So I've seen people do this in first responder environments as well, where a leader will say, look, we've had a really tough call or a really tough week. Where are you all? Where's the team? Where are you guys now? And the team will say, we're in a pretty solid orange, or we're in burnt orange. We're in between orange and red. And then you can ask them, okay, what do you need in terms of cover? What would be helpful in terms of calm? What will calm you down? What kind of support do you need? How do you feel like you're going to get through this? Is there something we can do to support that? Do we need to bring in training or that type of thing? And then where are we in terms of what it means to be a part of this team? And so those types of conversations can occur once you use the stress continuum to assess where you are. And it can become very much a matter-of-fact way of proceeding with business. And lastly, I just want to play this clip about leadership, because this is Jordan Peterson on the Dr. Oz show talking about loss, because I like this example because it also highlights the importance of being a leader in a system. We've seen plenty of occasions where mental health professionals have been called and said, we need your help because the team is really struggling with a very difficult circumstance. And the mental health professional, because they're informed and smart about the stress first aid model, will say, okay, well, tell me about it. And what has leadership done first before you bring me in? Because we don't necessarily need to bring me in. A lot of times it's about the leader playing a very particular role. And in this context, Jordan Peterson is talking about dealing with loss and how a leader can be a leader within a family, but I think it applies to organizations as well, particularly organizations that are dealing with loss regularly.
You should be the strongest person at your father's funeral, right? No, that's something to aim for. It's a transition, a generational transition. And it means that, well, all the people around you are suffering because of their loss. They have someone to turn to who can illustrate by their behavior that the force of character is sufficient to move you beyond the catastrophe. And you need that. And that's a great thing to hypothesize as your aim. And happiness just evaporates as irrelevant in light of that sort of conceptualization. There's at least the sense that you've taken something that could be very much like hell and made it far better than it could have been. And there's also the fact that, if you've matured enough, let's say, to deal with the catastrophe of loss and death, that you can also be the rallying point for the remnants of your family and pull them together at a moment of crisis. And that's a payoff to some degree for the loss. And I mean, I've seen this in families who've dealt with death properly. The remainder of the family pulls together, they become more integrated. And it's not complete compensation for their loss, but it's not nothing. That's what you're aiming at, is that perfection of yourself. And that'll keep you busy for your entire life. And it'll do no harm, right? It'll make you better. It'll make your family better. It'll make your community better. And it'll give you And it's psychologically meaningful. So there's all that. It helps you withstand suffering and disperse malevolence. But it's also extraordinarily practical, because if you become a better person, then you start to be good for things. You can fix problems. You can handle a funeral. You can handle a difficult situation, And so it's not only that it's psychologically meaningful to pursue the highest of goals and the development of your character, but it's also the best possible thing that you can do practically here and now in the material world to make it less terrible than it might otherwise be.
So I know it's a long clip and it's an emotional clip in a lot of ways, but I've seen first responders be very affected by loss and other incidents. The leaders are also affected, and I've seen leaders from other organizations reach out to them in that time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the leader within that small group who's providing the leadership role by themselves. Oftentimes another leader from another division or organization will reach out to them and say, hey, I've been through something similar. What can I do to help? Here's how I got through it. And again, they create that scaffolding around a system that needs that support right at that moment. So it can come from within, from the leader within the organization, or it can come from people around the smaller unit who also step in to provide that leadership. So it's a very, very important point. We're talking more and more about leadership, and we're trying to build that more and more into social support and this model. So I want to end with just showing one example of how stress first aid has been rolled out within a large-scale organization in the Department of Forestry and wildland firefighters. As I said, we had focus groups come together of people who were identified as good leaders or peers. I gathered information from them about specific examples of how they could implement stress first aid. We had a validation meeting where they came together and I presented the findings, and we refined them somewhat a little bit further. We created strategies from the quotes that they gave me. And then from that point on, we've had a series of training of trainers. They started out as 2-day training of trainers, and they became 3-day training of trainers, because the people who were coming to them were realizing this was a bit of a retreat. And in learning about the model, it also gave them an opportunity to talk about their experiences and how they dealt with those experiences, or how they needed to deal with those experiences, and in a very supportive environment. So we just, from that point, we've had 2 training of trainers per year. And in the last few years, we've also incorporated prior trainers to come back for these trainings as table coaches. It's a very important role for them, because they get to be the group lead at tables, to lead the small group discussions, to talk about their experiences as a trainer and as a person who provides stress first aid. And it builds their capacity, and also really adds to the experience for the trainees. So wonderful model. In the last year, it's become virtual, and we have an online portal and asynchronous and synchronous learning. But it's been a model that I've really been inspired by, because it's slowly, making its way out into the wildland firefighter community. We decided to have it be kind of a grassroots effort to start with, so it wasn't imposed from a top down, you must do this. We wanted people to take it up as they felt it could be useful. And we also have support from leadership, but it's growing, day to day and year to year. So key points about social support and about the way that we've operationalized it into our stress first aid model. We know that social support is one of the strongest protective factors in situations of ongoing stress and adversity, as well as following potentially traumatic events. We know that any efforts to operationalize and facilitate social support, such as through our stress first aid model, should highlight the protective nature of social support without being prescriptive about how the support should be given or sought out, because people have their own way of doing these things. We want them to feel empowered to act out social support in whatever way makes the most sense for them, for the person in front of them, and for the circumstances. The efforts can improve also employee well-being with better self-care, coworker support, as well as leadership. And any social support efforts can also reduce the stigma that creates obstacles to receiving support. We know that that's a very big piece of it. The more you get people talking in a matter-of-fact way about stress reactions, and social support in the same way that those military service members were talking about it in the video, the more likely I think you'll see that people will be more open about talking about their stress reactions. And social support also includes the way an organization identifies issues, values its employees, comes together when times are tough, and problem solve solutions. So we hope that models like Stress First Aid will also increase an organization's ability to be able to say, look, we're in the orange zone, we're in the red zone. What do we need to do about it? What's making it worse? What are the obstacles? What can we do about those? I might not be able to solve all your problems, because a lot of leaders that we've spoken to have been reluctant to even bring up talking about stress, because they're afraid they won't have all the solutions. So we tell them, look, you don't have to have all the solutions. You just have to lean in the right direction, do the next right thing, and encourage people to problem solve. Your team will know that you can't solve all their problems, but they can come together and start to mitigate the stress in their own unique way, in whatever way makes the most sense to them. So hopefully the Stress First Aid model and this conversation about social support will help you. I know it's been a long presentation, so I look forward to answering your questions or hearing your comments. Please feel free to email me, and hopefully we'll have other chances to talk in our panel that's coming up, as well as I think we have other touch points at the end of each day. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you the best in the work that you're doing.